Imagine a mother's desperate choice as chemical fires rain from the sky. She thrusts her paralyzed daughter into the arms of a human medic, her alien eyes pleading through a glitching translator. The medic's oath clashes with survival instinct as shuttle engines scream behind them. This is where their story begins, a bond forged in evacuation chaos that would redefine both their species. What happened next went beyond any protocol, beyond any rescue mission anyone could have imagined. The sky burned orange-black, heavy with chemical smoke that stung the eyes and clawed at the throat. Chunks of the outpost's infrastructure crashed into the landing zone, sending up gouts of dirt and flame. Amid the chaos, Elra stumbled forward, one arm cradling her daughter, the other shielding them from falling debris. Sweat and soot streaked her blue skin in dark trails. Each ragged breath made her translator emit a fractured burst of static. Like a machine gasping for air, she moved with singular purpose. Her gaze fixed on the human medic loading a stretcher into the nearest shuttle. Tom Bryant was already calculating time versus survivable exposure levels when she reached him. Without words, without ceremony, she pressed her child into his arms. The girl was unnervingly still, her limbs limp, her large eyes half-lidded and unfocused. Tom's hands accepted the weight before his mind could fully process it, a reflex born of training, even as his instincts screamed about the protocol breach. The child felt different. She was lighter than any human child he'd ever held, her skin cooler to the touch, almost like polished stone. Her breathing was shallow, rhythmic in a way that suggested sedation or spinal shock. Around them, the evacuation had devolved into a panicked scramble. The shuttle engines whined higher, a piercing scream that drowned out pleas and shouted orders. Tom's internal conflict was immediate and brutal. His medical oath demanded he treat any patient in need. His military conditioning reminded him that human lives came first on a human-led mission. He had seconds to decide, seconds measured in the falling fire and the closing shuttle ramps. Elra did not wait for his decision. Her eyes locked onto his, and in them was no hesitation, no doubt, only an unshakable faith that she was placing her child in the right hands. That trust was the one variable his training manuals had never covered. Why would an alien mother, a stranger from a species humans had only recently encountered, choose him? There were other Zetan evacuees, other medics, but she had crossed the chaotic divide between species lines to reach him specifically. It wasn't desperation, it was conviction. The final boarding alarm cut through the noise, a shrill, repeating tone that meant the shuttles were sealing up. Tom shifted the girl's weight, securing her against his chest with one arm. He met Elra's gaze and gave a single sharp nod. There was no time to explain, no time to reassure. He turned and moved toward the shuttle ramp, the girl a silent, trusting weight in his arms. Elra did not follow. She remained standing in the burning darkness as the ramp closed between them. The shuttle bucked hard, thrown sideways by an explosion that ripped through the cargo bay. Emergency lights flickered, then died. The air filled with the shriek of tearing metal and the acrid smell of burnt wiring. Tom's body reacted before his mind could catch up. His hands found the emergency webbing straps beside his seat. He worked quickly, securing the Zetan child tight against his chest. Her small body remained limp, unresponsive to the violence around them. Impact came not as a controlled landing but as a brutal collision. The shuttle tore through the jungle canopy, shearing off branches and tearing open the hull. The sound was immense, a grinding shriek of metal and splintering wood. When the craft finally came to rest, silence fell, heavy and disorienting. Through a gash in the hull plates, unfamiliar air seeped in. It carried the sharp scent of ozone from the crash mixed with the sweet, cloying perfume of alien blossoms. Groans came from the darkness. Movement. The living. Tom counted 4 humans among the 9 survivors. The numbers were bad. They meant rationing, hard choices, impossible triage. Serrano was already moving, his training overriding shock. He began a silent inventory of weapons, checking sidearms and whatever could be salvaged from the wreckage. Garcia checked the breached hull, his eyes scanning the dense jungle outside for signs of pursuit. Then came the sound. A low guttural click from the tree line. It was not mechanical. It was organic, predatory. It cut through the stillness and raised the hair on Tom's neck. In that moment, his fear was a cold, sharp thing in his gut. His own survival screamed at him to prioritize the able-bodied, to follow the protocol drilled into him. A paralyzed alien child was a liability in a hostile environment. She could not run, could not fight. would require constant care and resources they did not have. The math of survival was brutally clear, but his medical training surfaced first a deeper instinct than fear. A medic's duty is not conditional. It does not calculate odds or weigh species, it acts. Elra's absolute faith, the weight of the child against his chest, these were not variables in an equation. They were a fact. He had made a promise with a nod, and that promise was more binding than any protocol. He lowered the girl gently onto a relatively flat section of crumpled deck plating. Her breathing was still shallow, her blue skin cool. He began a methodical assessment, his fingers checking for pulse, for pupil response, for any sign of worsening spinal shock. The guttural click came again, closer this time. Tom ignored it. His focus narrowed to the patient. The paralyzed Zayton child was his first priority. Everything else was background noise. The creatures did not reveal themselves all at once. They moved at the edges of vision, shadows shifting within deeper shadows. Their coordination was unnerving, a silent choreography that suggested communication beyond sound. They flowed around the survivors' makeshift defensive positions like a single organism of living darkness, testing angles, probing for weakness without ever committing to an attack. Garcia spotted the first one clearly. It stood twice the size of a large wolf, its body low to the ground and supported by 6 powerful multi-jointed legs. The creature's hide was a mottled gray-black, blending seamlessly with the jungle's gloom. But it was the teeth that held his attention. They were not bone or fang, but clusters of sharp, translucent crystal that caught the faint light and fractured it into prismatic glints. The creature watched him for a long moment, its head cocked, then melted back into the undergrowth without a sound. This was the kind of predator that had evolved to hunt the survivors of Zeta 9. They were not mere animals driven by hunger or instinct. Their movements showed tactical intelligence. They used the terrain, flanking the crash site in a loose semicircle, their positions covering all likely escape routes. Low clicks passed between them, a language of soft percussions that seemed to coordinate their movements. They were not hunting scattered individuals. They were assessing an organized group, and their strategy reflected that. The situation turned critical when Vega's compound fracture became apparent. The bone had broken through skin and fabric during the crash, a brutal wound that bled steadily onto the leaf litter. In any other circumstance, it would demand immediate attention. Here, with these hunters nearby, the smell of blood was a death sentence. It escalated the threat from a standoff to an imminent attack. Tom realized the truth as he watched their patterns. These were not animals. They were hunters, intelligent and adaptive. The chemical fires from Outpost Krios had done more than burn. They had triggered a rapid, aggressive evolution in the local fauna, pushing predators to new levels of cunning and cooperation. These creatures had learned to prey on organized groups, perhaps Zetan patrols, perhaps other colonial teams, rather than solitary animals. Their pack intelligence surpassed anything found in Earth's natural world. They did not just hunt. They planned. Their patience was the most frightening quality. They did not rush. They waited, encircling, their crystal teeth occasionally visible in the dark like shards of broken glass. They were evaluating the survivors' readiness, their cohesion, their weak points. They were counting, and they had already identified the injured and the immobile. The silent clicks continued, a conversation in the dark that decided who would live and who would die. The jungle had become a tactical map, and these creatures were the masters of it. They were evolution's answer to intrusion, and they were not forgiving. Tom spread the emergency blanket on a patch of flattened undergrowth, its silver material stark against the alien soil. He laid the girl down carefully, her body unnervingly still. Her breathing remained shallow, a quiet rhythm that seemed too fragile for the harsh reality of their surroundings. Her blue skin had lost its usual vivid tone, taking on a pale, almost gray cast that spoke of shock and systemic stress. He had no scanners, no imaging equipment, nothing from his human medical training that applied to Zetan physiology. Her spinal structure was different. Her nervous system mapped along pathways he could only guess at. Standard human protocols for paralysis were worse than useless here. They were potentially deadly. He moved to the wreckage, his hands searching for something, anything, that could serve as a tool. He found a section of torn hull plating, its edge sharp enough to cut. He worked it back and forth until a long, narrow strip of metal broke free. He bent it into a crude but functional brace, using torn fabric from a seat harness to pad the areas that would contact skin. It was primitive, a traction device born of desperation, but it might stabilize her neck and upper spine if the injury was mechanical. The alternative was doing nothing, and that was not an option. His med kit offered human anti-inflammatories, powerful drugs that could reduce swelling in a human spinal cord. But cross-species biology was a minefield. A medication that saved a human could be a neurotoxin to a Zetan. He set the drugs aside, his decision made without second thought. The risk was too great. He would have to find another way. Elra watched him from a few paces away, her posture tense. Her translator emitted a soft, broken crackle, the sound of a system overwhelmed by stress. She did not interfere, did not speak. Her eyes followed his every movement, weighing his actions with the intensity that felt like a physical pressure. He worked under her silent scrutiny, his touch becoming his primary diagnostic tool. His fingers traced the lines of the girl's back and neck, mapping the unfamiliar terrain of alien vertebrae and muscle groups. He felt for swelling, for misalignment, for any sign of a fracture. The absence of obvious deformity gave him a sliver of hope. This paralysis might not be from a break. It could be inflammation, severe trauma to the nerves from the crash impact. If that was true, then the condition might not be permanent. Reduction of swelling could restore function, but every assumption was a gamble. Every choice carried the potential for fatal error across a biological divide he did not understand. Applying traction to the wrong area could cause more damage. Doing nothing could allow swelling to crush delicate neural tissues unique to her species. He adjusted the metal brace, his movements slow and deliberate. He was operating on intuition, building a treatment plan from scratch with a predator-filled jungle at his back and a mother's unwavering faith as his only guide. The weight of it was immense. He was not just a medic trying to save a patient. He was a human making decisions for an alien child, each one a step into the unknown. He tightened the final strap, his fingers pausing for a second on the cool metal. The work was done. Now they would see if it was enough. Serrano gathered the 4 standing survivors in the lee of the wrecked shuttle. The predators remained at the tree line, their low clicking calls a constant reminder of the circle tightening around them. He did not raise his voice. His words were flat, stripped of emotion, a simple statement of tactical reality. We have 2 critically injured and limited mobility. The numbers were clear. 9 survivors, 2 completely incapacitated. 4 humans, including himself, capable of moving and fighting. 3 Zetans who were shaken but mobile. Their supplies were minimal. Their exposure was total. The jungle was unknown. The threat was intelligent and patient. Protocol says prioritize those who can contribute to survival, he stated. It was not a suggestion. It was doctrine, standard operating procedure for crash scenarios in hostile environments. The math was brutal but logical. Carrying the injured would slow the group to a crawl. It would require splitting attention, dividing resources, creating vulnerabilities the predators would exploit. The 2 patients, Vega with his compound fracture and the paralyzed Zetan child, represented a drain on the group's slim chances. The protocol was designed to save the majority, not to sacrifice everyone for a few. It was a calculus of cold, hard numbers. Tom did not argue the math. He simply moved. He positioned himself between Serrano and the 2 injured figures lying on the ground. He did not draw a weapon. He did not raise his voice. His stance was his argument. He was a barrier. I'm a medic, he said. That's all the protocol I need. His statement hung in the air, a direct challenge to military doctrine. His duty was not to the many. It was to the individual in front of him. To abandon that duty was to abandon the core of what made him who he was. It was a line he would not cross, even for survival. Garcia shifted his weight, his eyes scanning the tree line. He understood Serrano's position. The logic was sound, but his gaze kept returning to the Zetan child, so still and silent, and to Vega, whose face was pale with pain and blood loss. He supported Tom, he said quietly, but his worry was for the whole group. Slowing down meant more time in the open, more time for the hunters to find a weakness. Their debate was not about cruelty. None of them wanted to leave people behind. It was a stark evaluation of survival mathematics, a grim equation where emotions were a liability they could not afford. The argument continued in hushed, tense exchanges. Vega's breathing provided a ragged counterpoint to the discussion. Each labored inhale, each pained exhale, was a reminder of the human cost of their decision. The sound seemed to grow weaker, shallower, as if the very act of debating his fate was draining the life from him. Elra watched silently, her alien face unreadable, but her body was rigid with a fear that needed no translation. The clicking from the jungle intensified slightly. The predators were growing restless. The decision could wait no longer. Every second spent arguing was a second lost. In the end, there was no vote. No formal agreement. The moment simply resolved itself. Serrano looked from Tom's determined face to Vega's struggling form. He gave a short, sharp nod, a curt gesture to Garcia. They would move. And they would carry their wounded. It was illogical. It was dangerous. It defied all training, but it was the only choice that let them look at themselves afterward. They began gathering materials to fashion makeshift stretchers. Their movements hurried now, the predator's patience clearly wearing thin. The group would stay together for better or worse. The girl's eyes opened while they were moving. The group was struggling up a steep rocky incline, carrying the injured on makeshift stretchers. Tom was helping to support Vega's weight when he felt a shift in the small form against his chest. He looked down. Her eyes were focused on him with a clarity that had been absent since the crash. They were large, dark, and unnervingly intelligent. She did not speak at first. She just watched him. A moment later, the translator unit on her small wrist flickered with a weak light. A single word emerged, distorted and stripped of tone. A broken whisper forced through damaged circuits. "You," the word hung between them. Elra moved closer, her own translator emitting a burst of frustrated static. She tried to speak to her daughter, but the device failed again, collapsing her words into nonsensical clicks and fragmented whistles. The sounds were complex, layered with inflection the machine could not process. They were clearly a language, but one the technology was not built to understand. Tom saw the problem immediately. Communication here would require more than a machine. It would demand patience, observation, and a willingness to build a bridge from nothing. He stopped trying to rely on the broken technology. Instead, he used his hands. He pointed to his canteen, then mimed drinking. Water. He held up a hand, palm out, then pointed toward the jungle where the clicks had last been heard. Danger. He lowered the girl carefully to the ground for a moment and slumped his shoulders, closing his eyes briefly. Rest. The gestures were simple, universal. The girl watched his hands with intense concentration. She did not try to speak again. Instead, she responded with her own body. A subtle dip of her chin, a slow, deliberate blink, a slight movement of her fingers forming a shape he did not recognize but understood was intentional. It was a conversation without sound. He pointed to her injured back, then made a questioning gesture with his hands. "Does it hurt?" She closed her eyes for a long moment, then opened them. Oh, he pointed to her legs. "Can you move?" Another slow, deliberate blink. So they had established the basics. Yes and no, need and safety, a foundation. Her translator crackled back to life, the light on its surface flickering erratically. The voice that came out was still glitched, but the words were clearer, strung together with effort. "You are not from our people." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the simple clarity of a child who sees the world without filters. The statement hung in the humid air. It was the first true coherent sentence that had passed between them. It acknowledged the vast gulf of their difference, the human medic and the Zetan child, and yet, in the act of saying it, the gulf began to feel a little smaller. They had found a way across the silence. Elra returned from a solitary scouting trip along the ridge, her hands cupped around a cluster of small blue flowers. They were an intense, almost luminous shade of violet blue, with petals that seemed to absorb the fading light. She knelt beside Tom, who was redressing a gash on his forearm from the crash. She did not ask permission. Her movements were deliberate, assured. She placed the flowers on a flat stone and used a smaller rock to crush them. Her motions were neither hurried nor gentle, but precise. Each press and grind was practiced, a ritual performed countless times. The flowers released a sharp, clean scent like ozone and mint as they broke down into a thick, vivid paste. She gestured to Tom's arm. He hesitated for only a second before nodding. She applied the paste directly to his wound. The effect was immediate and startling. The steady seep of blood from the cut stopped within seconds as if a switch had been flipped. The paste seemed to contract slightly, forming a thin, flexible seal over the injury. The throbbing pain that had been a constant background noise since the crash diminished to a faint, cool sensation. Her translator, still glitching, managed to convey the basic explanation. My people use these, for generations. The knowledge was not from a laboratory or a medical text. It was ancient, born of necessity and passed down through her culture. The flowers, she explained, did not work through chemical compounds alone. They contained symbiotic microorganisms that actively accelerated the body's own healing processes. They were a living medicine. This was the core of the ancient healing knowledge Elra possessed. Human emergency medicine, as Tom practiced it, focused on sterilization. It sought to create a sterile field, to kill invading pathogens, to seal the body off from the outside world to prevent infection. Zedon medicine worked on an opposite principle. It was biointegration. It introduced controlled, beneficial life to assist the body's natural functions. It worked with the body's ecosystem, not against it. Tom observed the results on his own arm over the next hours. The inflammation around the wound decreased noticeably. The skin at the edges, which had been red and angry, began to show signs of rapid tissue regeneration. It was a type of healing his own medkit, with its antiseptics and synthetic coagulants, could never achieve. The partnership became instinctive after that. They began combining their knowledge. He used his understanding of human anatomy and field trauma care. She applied her botanical poultices and her understanding of biological integration. This fusion of technologies saved Vega's life. The compound fracture was a nightmare scenario. The open wound was a direct invitation for infection in the planet's humid, microbe-rich environment. Human antibiotics from the medkit were a start, but they were a broad-spectrum solution to a specific alien problem. Elra prepared a thicker poultice from a different plant, one with darker leaves she found near a water source. She mixed it with the blue flower paste. Together they cleaned the wound as best they could and packed it with the herbal mixture. The change was visible within a day. The ominous red streaks that typically signaled a systemic blood infection never appeared. The swelling went down. Vega's fever broke. The wound, while still severe, began to show clean, healthy tissue at its margins instead of the necrotic decay that should have set in. The fatal infection that should have claimed him was halted. It was a quiet, profound victory. It proved that their survival was no longer just a matter of human technology or alien knowledge. It was the space where the two met. The terrain changed as they climbed. The dense jungle gave way to a landscape of jagged, towering formations. They were not rock. They were crystal, rising from the earth like the ruins of vast, shattered cathedrals made of glass. The light that filtered through them fractured into 1,000 spectral colors, painting the ground in shifting patterns of blue and violet. The air itself felt different here, charged with a faint static energy that raised the fine hairs on Tom's arms. Sound behaved strangely. Snapped twig did not just echo. Its sound lingered, repeating softly for several seconds as if the very air was reluctant to let it go. A low word spoken by Garcia seemed to hang between them. Its syllables stretched and softened before fading into the crystalline silence. The effect was disorienting, a sensory distortion that made it difficult to judge distance or direction. This was the domain of whispers, a place where auditory rules no longer applied. Tom first heard the true whispers during a bout of fever. The infection in his wound, though checked by Elra's poultice, had left him weak and sweating. In that blurred state between waking and sleeping, he heard voices. They had no source. They did not seem to come from a direction. They simply existed in the air around him, calm and indistinct. At first, he dismissed them as delirium, but the voices did not speak to him. They spoke of him. They suggested things. The water to the east is tainted. Follow the light through the narrow pass. The hunters circled the southern ridge. The information was specific, practical, and it arrived not as a command but as a simple statement of fact. Elra heard them too. She stopped often, her head tilted, listening to the silent air. Her people had legends about this place, she explained through her glitching translator. They believed the mountains were alive, that the crystals stored the knowledge and memories of the world, replaying them for those who knew how to listen. They were not ghosts. They were echoes of a different kind of intelligence. The group began to trust the guidance. When the whispers suggested a path looked unstable, they found another way. When the voice mentioned a clean spring hidden behind a waterfall of crystal shards, they found it exactly as described. The information consistently led them away from the clicking predators, guiding their route through the labyrinthine formations with an uncanny accuracy. They were no longer just moving. They were being led. They came to realize the mountains were not merely a geological feature. They were in some fundamental way alive. The intelligence they sensed was not biological. It did not think or feel as they did. It was crystalline, ancient, and utterly alien. It perceived the world through vibrations, through the propagation of sound and energy through its vast structure. It was a recorder and a library, a silent witness to eons of planetary history. Its help felt neither friendly nor hostile. It was simply a function of its existence, an offer of stored data to any being capable of receiving it. For Tom and Elra, it was a lifeline. For the mountains, it was perhaps just the faint rustle of pages turning in an immeasurably old book. The whispers were the turning of those pages, and for a short time they were allowed to read them. They reached the heart of the mountain. The chamber was immense, its walls formed of the same crystalline substance as the peaks outside. But here the light was different. It did not come from an external source. It pulsed from within the stone itself, a soft, shifting luminescence that moved like frozen lightning captured in a vast, intricate web. The air hummed with a low-frequency vibration that they felt in their bones more than heard. It was a sound of immense age and dormant power. Figures emerged from the walls. They were not beings that walked. They were forms of interlocking crystal that flowed across the chamber floor, their structures constantly rearranging, shifting, and reforming as they moved. Light pulsed through them in intricate, non-repeating patterns, a language of energy and form that was utterly alien. They were vaguely humanoid in shape, but clearly something else, something older and fundamentally different from any life Tom or Elra had ever known. They did not speak with voices. Communication came as a pressure in the mind, a direct transfer of thought and image that bypassed the need for sound. A series of images unfolded in their consciousness. They saw Zeta 9 as it once was, a world of vast silent forests and deep calm seas. They saw the first intelligent life rise, a species that lived in harmony with the planet's unique energy fields. They saw this species, the first ones, undergo a voluntary transformation, shedding their biological forms to become one with the crystalline structures of the mountains, achieving a form of immortality as custodians of the world's memory and knowledge. The chamber around them was not a room. It was a library, a living record. Then came the vision of the chemical fires, the crash of the human outpost, the toxic compounds seeping into the soil and water. The images showed how the disaster had done more than burn and poison. It had acted as a catalyst, a violent shock to the planet's subtle energy networks. It had awakened the first ones from their long dormancy. It had also triggered the rapid, aggressive evolution of the predators, twisting the local fauna into the intelligent hunters now stalking the survivors. The thought forms clarified. The bond between Tom and Elra was the element that had drawn their attention. Human and Zetan, healer and the one who needed healing. Their connection, forged in desperation and strengthened by mutual trust, represented a new pattern. It was a catalyst. The first ones were not offering a simple cure for their wounds. They were offering a transformation, a fundamental change that would merge their strengths, that would make them something new. A fusion of human resilience, Zetan biointegration, and the ancient knowledge of the first ones. The offer was clear. It was not a request. It was an opportunity born from disaster. The two of them together had become the key to a change that went far beyond their own survival. Their bond was the necessary ingredient, the bridge that could connect three disparate forms of life into a new whole. The final thought image that washed over them was not a warning, but a simple, profound statement of what was to come. A vision of two distinct entities merging, their boundaries dissolving, their strengths combining into a single, more resilient form. A silent whisper echoed in the charged air, a concept more than a sound, two becoming one. The offer was not a simple procedure. It was a complete and permanent biological alteration. The crystalline beings made their intent clear through a direct flow of thought and image, a concept communicated without ambiguity. This was not a healing. It was a metamorphosis. The process would rewrite them on a fundamental level, changing cellular structure, neural pathways, and their very consciousness. The transformation required more than their bodies. It required their full participation, a conscious surrender to the change. Elra accepted without hesitation. Her people's culture held transformation as a sacred concept, a necessary and revered step in both personal and species evolution. To become something new was not a loss but an advancement, an honor. She saw the offer not as a risk but as a logical and profound next step for herself and her daughter. Her decision was immediate and absolute. Tom hesitated. The weight of the choice pressed on him with a physical force. He was a human. His identity was tied to that specific biology, to a lifetime of experience in a human body. To accept this was to willingly let that self die. He was a medic, a soldier. His training was to preserve life, not to erase one form so another could emerge. He stood at the precipice, weighing the abstract concept of his human identity against the tangible, brutal needs of survival on this planet. To remain as he was meant, continuing a desperate struggle with high odds of failure. To change was to step into the utterly unknown. The first ones understood his conflict. They did not argue or persuade. They simply showed him. A new series of visions unfolded in his mind. He saw himself and Elra as they would become. Not as separate beings, but as a deeply connected unit. Their bond would evolve beyond trust and cooperation into a near telepathic communication. They would share thoughts, sensations, and intentions with a clarity that made words obsolete. Their physical capabilities would be enhanced, exceeding the natural limitations of either human or Zetan biology. Strength, speed, sensory perception, and healing would all operate at a new level. They would become a perfect fusion of human resilience, Zetan adaptability, and the ancient, crystalline knowledge of the first ones. They would be ideally suited not just to survive Zeta 9, but to understand it. The vision was powerful. But it was not the promise of enhanced abilities that decided him. It was the memory of his promise. He looked at Elra, who waited for his answer with calm certainty. He remembered the burning landing zone, the moment she had thrust her child into his arms and placed her absolute faith in him. He had accepted that responsibility with a nod. This was the final extension of that promise. To turn back now, to choose his own familiar humanity over the chance to fully keep his word to her, would make that initial act of faith meaningless. His agreement was not for power. It was for completion. He gave a single slow nod. The change began. Tom awoke. His body felt both foreign and intensely his own. He flexed his fingers, watching the play of light across his skin. A network of faint crystalline patterns now lay just beneath the surface, visible only when the light caught them at a certain angle. They traced the lines of his tendons and veins like a delicate living map. He looked around the chamber. His vision had changed. He could see the heat signature of the rocks cooling from the previous day's sun. A faint red glow against the cooler blues and purples of the pre-dawn jungle. The world was now painted in a broader spectrum, revealing details that were once invisible. Elra stirred beside him. Her movement was the first thing he noticed. She stood with a fluid grace that was entirely new. The stiffness, the careful compensation for her daughter's weight, the subtle signs of her own exhaustion, all of it was gone. She moved with an economy and precision that was purely functional, and yet looked effortless. Her paralysis had not just been healed. It had been replaced with a physical capability that surpassed her original Zetan state. She tested her strength, lifting a piece of crystalline rubble that would have taken both of them to move before. She held it with ease, her expression one of calm assessment rather than strain. The most profound change was not in their bodies, but in the space between them. They could sense each other's emotional state, without a single word. A flicker of his analytical focus registered in her mind as a quiet hum of concentration. Her sense of renewed purpose and strength echoed in his own consciousness, a steady, grounding pulse. It was not a stream of thoughts or a conversation. It was a shared emotional landscape, a constant low-level awareness of the other's presence and state of being. They did not need to speak to coordinate. An intention to move formed in one mind and was understood by the other, a fraction of a second before the body acted. Their physical strength had increased to a similar degree. What had been a struggle was now manageable. Carrying the injured, moving wreckage, hauling supplies. These tasks required less effort, their enhanced muscles performing with a new efficiency. When Tom examined a shallow cut on his hand from the previous day, he watched as the edges of the wound visibly knitted together over the course of an hour. The healing process, which should have taken days, was accelerated to a rate that defied his medical understanding. The biology of both species had been rewritten, optimized for survival in the most extreme conditions. Knowledge of the territory appeared in their minds not as learned information, but as instinct. They knew the quickest path to clean water. They understood which plants were nutritious and which were toxic. They could sense the general location of the crystalline predators, not as a specific threat, but as a pressure on the edge of their awareness, like knowing a storm is approaching by the change in the air. This was not a gift from the first one so much as it was an integration. They had become part of Zeta-9's ecosystem in a way that was fundamental and cellular. They were no longer human in Zetan. They were something else entirely. A fusion of biological resilience, crystalline enhancement, and a deep instinctive connection to a world that was once alien to them both. The transformation had not simply given them new abilities. It had redefined their very existence, creating a new form of life, built for the harsh realities of their new home. Tom became aware of the low-grade ache in Elra's lower back before she even shifted her posture. It registered in his own awareness as a faint, persistent thrum of discomfort, a sensation that was not his own, but was as clear as if it were. This was the new reality of their connection. The telepathic link granted by the first ones was not a voice in his head or a stream of her thoughts. It was a shared state of being, a merging of their conscious and subconscious perceptions that changed everything about how they interacted with the world and each other. This link became their greatest tactical advantage. During the next predator attack, there was no need for shouted warnings or hand signals. A surge of focused intent from Tom was all that was required for Elra to pivot, her staff striking the exact spot he had visually identified as a weak point on the creature's flank. Their movements were perfectly synchronized, a seamless dance of defense and counterattack that required no visual confirmation. They fought as a single entity, their actions anticipatory rather than reactive. The bond made them exponentially more effective than any highly trained military team, their coordination absolute and instantaneous. The connection was not limited to the present moment. Unbidden fragments of memory would sometimes surface in their shared awareness. A flash of a cold human winter morning from Tom's childhood, the sharp smell of pine and frozen earth would cross between them. A moment later, the warm, fragrant air of a Zetan communal garden from Elra's youth would follow. These memories arrived without context or explanation, brief windows into the lives they had lived before this bond. They were not intrusive, but they underscored the profound intimacy of their new existence, weaving the fabric of their separate pasts into a single, complex tapestry. The strength of this link was directly tied to their physical proximity. When they stood close, the connection was a strong, clear channel. They could sense the subtle nuances of each other's emotional states and unformed intentions. As the distance between them increased, the signal faded to a vague awareness, a faint hum of the other's presence on the edge of consciousness. They quickly learned this was a physical limitation of the bond, a tether that stretched but could also grow thin. This constant connection came with a significant vulnerability, emotional bleed. Hiding feelings was functionally impossible. A spike of Tom's frustration at a broken piece of equipment would resonate in Elra as a jangle of irritable energy. Her quiet wave of concern for her daughter's safety would appear in his mind as a cold, weightless dread. There were no secrets in their emotional landscape. This forced a level of honesty and self-awareness that was as challenging as it was intimate. They had to learn mental discipline, developing techniques to shield their most private thoughts not for deception, but to maintain individual cognitive space amidst the constant merger. Despite the challenges, the connection began to feel completely natural. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with a rich, wordless communication that felt more direct and truthful than language had ever been. They developed a sophisticated lexicon of silent communication strategies for survival, using focused bursts of intent to signal directions, identify threats, or coordinate complex tasks without making a sound. This was their new language, built on a foundation of shared consciousness. It was the ultimate tool for survival on a hostile world, turning two isolated individuals into a unified, resilient whole. The abandoned outpost was a graveyard of broken technology and silent machines. Tom's enhanced senses led them to a sealed laboratory section, its door warped but still holding against the exterior damage. Inside they found rows of containment units, most shattered, a few still intact. The air was thick with the smell of old chemicals and decay. One unit remained powered, its display screen flickering with corrupted data. This was where the answers were stored. The dangerous secret was in the sample containers. The compound was not a simple chemical agent. It was a microorganism-laden substance designed for terraforming, intended to alter Zeta-9's atmosphere to make it more habitable for human colonies. The molecular structure of the substance was unstable, almost alive, constantly reorganizing itself in ways the designers had not predicted. It was not meant for the local biology. It was an environmental tool that had escaped its controlled parameters. Instead of adapting the atmosphere, the compound had interacted with the native ecosystem in a catastrophic way. It did not just poison, it mutated. It accelerated the evolution of the local fauna, pushing predators to new levels of intelligence and aggression. The creatures hunting them were not a natural feature of the planet. They were an accident, a product of corporate experimentation gone horribly wrong. The disaster was not an act of nature. It was a manufactured crisis. Human corporations had cut safety testing protocols to accelerate profits and meet colonial expansion deadlines. The desire for a quick return on investment overrode all environmental safeguards. The compound was deployed before long-term stability studies were completed, before its interaction with Zetan biology was fully understood. The decision was a calculated risk, and the calculation had failed. The cost of that failure was measured in the lives lost at Outpost Krios, and the transformed hellscape the survivors now navigated. The contamination had spread much further than the official reports admitted. The initial disaster zone was only the epicenter. The compound was airborne and water-soluble, carried on the wind and in the streams, affecting a radius far beyond the outpost's perimeter. The entire region was compromised. The official story was containment. The reality was widespread ecological sabotage. The Zetan government knew. Their sensors would have detected the anomalous spread, the changes in the wildlife. 但他们接受了人类的付款，以保持沉默. The disaster was a preventable tragedy. Greed caused the evolution crisis. A desire for profit on one side and complicit acceptance on the other created the conditions for the entire outpost to fall. The truth was a toxic asset that both sides had buried under lies and mutual agreements. Tom and Elra documented everything. They used salvage data drives, recording the chemical analysis, the corporate identification codes on the containers, the environmental spread patterns their enhanced senses could now map. They made multiple backup copies, storing them on different devices and on crystalline data shards provided by the first ones. The evidence was solid, irrefutable, and immensely dangerous. The truth they carried was a spark that could ignite an interspecies conflict. If revealed carelessly, it would not be seen as a call for accountability. It would be a weapon. Humans would blame Zetan complicity. Zetans would blame human negligence. The delicate, nascent trust between their species would shatter, likely in violence. They held proof that the disaster was everyone's fault and no one's. A chain of greed and silence that led to a burning sky and mutated hunters. The weight of that knowledge was heavier than any weapon. It was the power to start a war or force a reconciliation, and the choice of how to use it would define the future for both their peoples. The confirmation signal from the rescue team arrived precisely 48 hours after they had activated the emergency beacon. It was a simple encrypted pulse of data, but it carried the weight of their entire future. For Tom and Elra, the response was not a signal of salvation. It was trigger for a new level of danger. They had to make a deliberate choice, and that choice was to hide the full truth of what they had become. Their enhanced connection made the decision a shared one, formed and agreed upon in a silent exchange of understanding and mutual concern. They began to practice immediately. The telepathic link, which had become their most vital tool for survival, had to be suppressed. They trained themselves to lower the signal from a constant, clear channel to a faint, almost subconscious hum. It was like forcing a powerful muscle to remain slack. They worked to communicate only through spoken language and subtle glances again, rebuilding the slower, less efficient methods they had used before the transformation. It felt like willingly putting on a set of heavy restraints after knowing perfect freedom of movement. Their physical enhancements posed another challenge. Increased strength, accelerated healing, heightened senses. These could be explained away. Survival in extreme conditions could force the body to adapt in surprising ways. People could believe in adrenaline-fueled feats of strength. They could accept rapid recovery as a product of clean living and determination. They practiced moderating their movements, consciously holding back their full strength when lifting objects, feigning fatigue when none was truly felt. They had to perform a version of their old, weaker selves. The visible crystalline patterns under their skin were the most damning evidence. These were not something that could be explained by survival adaptation. They practiced a new skill: mental control over their own biology. They learned to will the patterns to fade, to recede deep beneath the dermis until they were invisible to the naked eye. It required intense concentration, a constant low-level effort of will to maintain the camouflage. It was like holding their breath indefinitely, a suppression of their true nature. The reason for this massive concealment was absolute. Both of their species would view them not as people, but as experiments. They would become the most valuable scientific specimens in known space. Human and Zetan researchers alike would be consumed by a burning, insatiable curiosity. That curiosity would not respect their rights or their autonomy. It would override them. They would be taken, studied, probed, and likely separated for the rest of their lives. They would cease to be Tom and Elra. They would become Subject Alpha and Subject Beta. Their agreement was silent but total. They would keep their connection, their true nature, a private thing until they could be certain it was safe to reveal. The documented evidence of the corporate disaster and the Zetan complicity would be their shield and their tool. They would release that information gradually, through proper and official channels, using the political upheaval it would cause to create a fog that might hide their own secret. Their immediate survival, and their future freedom, now depended entirely on their ability to maintain appearances. They had to walk back into their old worlds and convincingly pretend to be normal, all while carrying the knowledge and the power of something utterly new inside them. The rescue was not an ending. It was the beginning of a much more complex mission. The shuttle settled on the scorched landing pad, its engines winding down with a high-pitched whine. The ramp lowered, and the extraction team moved out with practiced efficiency. They were a mixed unit of human and Zetan personnel, their movements coordinated but separate, following the ingrained protocols for disaster recovery. Medical kits and sensor packs were deployed, a standard response to an expected scene of trauma and disarray. The team commander, a human with the insignia of a senior field officer, took 3 steps onto the ash-covered ground and then stopped. His eyes fixed on the 2 figures walking toward them from the shadow of a collapsed hangar. A human man and a Zetan woman. They moved together. Their strides matched, their postures not of rescued victims but of equals meeting colleagues. There was no fear in their eyes, no relief. Only a calm, assessing confidence that was completely at odds with the devastation around them. This image of cross-species parity, of unbroken composure, was the first break in standard procedure. The medics moved forward, scanners humming. They noted the readings immediately. Elevated heart rates but steady. Strange neural activity patterns, enhanced cellular regeneration markers. The data was anomalous, outside normal parameters for either species, even accounting for extreme stress. The lead medic glanced at the commander, then dismissed the readings. They attributed the irregularities to prolonged exposure, to the unique stressors of the crash and survival on Zeta 9. It was easier to file the data under trauma than to question the foundation of their medical understanding. The entire rescue team had been briefed to expect victims. They were prepared for shock, for injury, for the psychological collapse that follows extreme isolation and danger. They found none of that. They found 2 individuals who were not just surviving, but who appeared to be in command of the situation. The team's training offered no framework for this. Their story, when they began to tell it, was one of cooperation, of shared strategy, of mutual protection. To the rescuers, it sounded improbable. The historical tension between their species, the fundamental biological differences, the lack of shared language protocols, everything in their experience argued against the seamless partnership Tom and Elra described. Standard debriefing protocols were designed for individuals. They relied on Fen-Chi interviews, on comparing stories for inconsistencies, on assessing psychological states in isolation. These tools were useless here. The commanders recognized this almost immediately. The only recourse was to insist on separate medical and psychological evaluations. It was a standard practice for ensuring individual well-being, but in this case it felt like an attempt to force their experience back into a manageable, familiar box. Tom and Elra agreed without argument. They maintained their cover story with a consistency that was flawless because it was partially true. They spoke of fighting predators, of finding shelter, of using their combined skills to survive. They simply omitted the transformation, the telepathy, the crystalline beings. They allowed their incredible luck and resilience to stand as the explanation. They told the same story separately, with no deviation in the details that mattered to the debriefing officers. Once cleared, they were escorted aboard the shuttle. They took seats opposite each other, strapping in as the craft lifted off. Through the viewport, the planet Zeta 9 dwindled below them. The chemical burns, the jungles, the glittering, whispering mountains, all of it shrank into a single scarred world. They did not speak. They did not need to. Their shared silence was a language of its own, a final look back at the place that had unmade and remade them, a quiet acknowledgement of the secret they now carried together into the civilized galaxy. The viewport showed their past receding. Their future was the silent understanding between them. Civilization meant separation. Tom was assigned to the human medical bay on the orbital platform's beta ring. Elra was quartered with other Zeton survivors in the Xenobiological Studies wing on Delta Ring. The distance was more than physical. It was a gulf of procedure, culture, and suspicion. The bond they shared, once a constant, clear channel, now stretched thin across the station's bulkheads. It remained but as a faint, persistent hum of awareness, a thread of connection they had to consciously focus on to feel. Maintaining it required discipline, a daily mental exercise in reaching across the artificial divide. Medical tests were mandatory. The scans showed anomalies. His cellular regeneration rates were elevated. Her neural activity displayed unusual synaptic patterns. The readings fell just within the broad, undefined ranges for extreme physiological adaptation. The doctors noted the data, attributed it to the unique stressors of Zeta 9, and filed the reports. It was easier to chalk it up to trauma than to question fundamental biological laws. They passed the evaluations, their bodies expertly performing the lie of normalcy. Communication was restricted to approved channels. Text-based messages on secured datapads, occasional supervised vidlink conferences. Their exchanges were models of professional courtesy, filled with the dry language of debriefings and planetary analysis. But layered within those official words were hidden meanings. A question about terrain stability was a check on his emotional state. A comment on resource availability was her signal that she was being monitored. They had built a second language on top of the first, a code only they could decipher. The truth about the chemical disaster began to leak. It did not come from them. It surfaced through back channels from low-level technicians and junior researchers who had seen the raw data. The corporate response was immediate and aggressive. Damage control teams initiated a campaign of counter-accusations, blaming Zetan environmental negligence and flawed colonial infrastructure. The public narrative became a confusing fog of conflicting reports. Their unique perspective made them invaluable. They were summoned to advisory sessions, asked to consult on Zeta 9's ecology and the predator behavior. They sat in sterile conference rooms, human and Zetan officials on opposite sides of the table. Tom and Elra became the bridge. He could explain Zetan cultural context to the humans. She could clarify human tactical protocols to her people. They translated more than language. They translated intent, helping each side see the other's fears and reasoning. This advisory role gave them a platform. They began to plan a gradual, controlled disclosure of their abilities. They identified a few trusted officials on each side, individuals who had shown pragmatism and open-mindedness. They would start with small revelations, perhaps their enhanced healing or their intuitive knowledge of the planet. The full truth of the telepathy and the crystalline transformation would come later, if at all. It was a dangerous gamble, but secrecy was a prison. The transformation was no longer just the event that had happened to them. It became their shared secret and their greatest strength. It was the reason they could sit in those tense meetings and understand the subtext in every glance. It was the quiet certainty that they were not alone, even when galaxies of protocol kept them apart. Their connection was the one stable point in a shifting political landscape, a private truth that gave them the confidence to navigate the very public lie. They were playing a long game, and their secret was the only card they held. Their first private meeting required 3 security clearances and a formal escort through a chain of guarded checkpoints. They were placed in a sterile debriefing room, its walls blank and its air filtered. A single table, 2 chairs. Observation cameras watched from the ceiling corners, their red lights glowing. The moment the guard closed the door, the telepathic link surged. It was not a gentle return. It was a powerful reconnection, a flood of shared sensation and unspoken thought that washed over the artificial silence of the room. The mental shields they had so carefully maintained across the station's distance fell away in an instant. The relief of it was a physical sensation for both of them. They did not speak aloud for a long moment. They shared everything that had happened during their separation through the link. A rapid silent exchange of images and emotions, his frustration with the endless medical tests, her isolation in the Zatan quarters, the subtle probing questions from their respective superiors, the constant low-grade effort of performing a version of their old selves. The exchange was comprehensive, layering the dry facts of their reports with the true emotional weight of their experience. In seconds, they were caught up, their separate ordeals merging back into a single shared reality. Elra's people had questions. Her survival, her physical condition, her calm demeanor, it all stood out. They pressed for details about the ancient Zetan healing knowledge she had used, interpreting her enhanced state as a return to some purer, traditional form of their culture. They saw a revival, not a transformation. Tom's military superiors were more direct. They wanted tactical information on the predators, their intelligence, their pack coordination, their weaknesses. They saw the planet as a future battlefield and wanted every advantage. The questions from both sides were relentless, but they circled the truth without ever touching it. Both maintained the agreed story. They spoke of natural adaptation, of survival forcing their bodies and minds to new limits. They described their cooperation as a practical necessity born of shared danger. They offered just enough truth to be believable, and withheld everything that mattered. It was a constant, careful dance, a performance they had to sustain every moment they were in the presence of others. Their cover was their primary defense. They used their brief, monitored time together to develop more sophisticated strategies for managing their enhanced abilities. They practiced fine-tuning the telepathic link, learning to reduce it to an almost undetectable whisper even when in close proximity. They reinforced their mental disciplines to prevent emotional bleed in stressful situations. They discussed how to explain their accelerated healing if a future injury was observed, crafting plausible medical justifications rooted in extreme stress responses. Every strategy was a layer of protection for their secret. The physical separation had been a strain, but it had not broken their bond. In some ways, it had deepened it. The constant effort of maintaining their connection across the distance, of feeling the other's presence as a faint but steady hum, had reinforced its importance. It was no longer just a tool for survival. It was the core of their identity. They realized their transformation was not a finished event. It was an ongoing process. Their bodies and minds were still adjusting, still integrating the changes. The connection felt like a living thing, still growing. This bond, this fusion of human and Zetan, represented something entirely new. It was a possibility that existed outside of official treaties or cultural exchange programs. It was a biological, psychological bridge between two species that had viewed each other with suspicion. They were living proof that the divides were not insurmountable. They were the blueprint for a different kind of future, one built not on diplomacy but on a fundamental shared existence. The unbreakable bond was their reality, and it was their greatest secret. The official orders came through on a standard data slate. Tom Bryant and Elra were assigned to the newly formed Zeta-9 planetary research team. The official cover story was an interspecies cooperation initiative, a public relations move to show unity after the disaster. Press releases talked about mutual understanding and shared scientific goals. The reality was much simpler. They were the only two people who truly understood the planet. Everyone else was studying data. They had lived it. Their enhanced abilities remained their most carefully concealed asset. They moved through the jungle with a confidence that their human and Zetan colleagues attributed to experience. They never showed their full strength, their accelerated healing, or the faint crystalline patterns that sometimes threatened to surface under stress. Their telepathic link was kept at its lowest setting, a private hum of coordination beneath the spoken words of their official duties. They were performing a careful, constant balancing act, projecting competence while hiding the true source of it. Their real work happened off the official record. They continued documenting the ecological changes secretly, using their intrinsic connection to the planet to map the spread of the mutated flora and fauna. They recorded the predator's new hunting patterns, the strange adaptations of the plant life, the subtle shifts in the very air. This data was not for the official reports. It was for their own understanding, a private record of a world in rapid, violent flux. The first ones occasionally communicated with them. It was not through words. It was through the small, unremarkable crystal shards they each carried in a pocket. The communication came as a sudden, clear knowing. An image of a rare plant with medicinal properties would appear in their minds. A warning of a coming ground shift near the research base would surface with absolute certainty. These moments were rare, but they were a constant reminder that their transformation had connected them to something ancient and fundamentally a part of Zeta 9. This connection was their key to survival. The planet was becoming increasingly hostile. The chemical legacy of the disaster continued to warp the ecosystem, creating new threats. Storms carried corrosive rains. Previously docile life forms exhibited aggressive new behaviors. Their transformation, which had once felt like a strange gift, was now a basic necessity. It allowed them to sense these dangers before they manifested, to navigate the toxic zones, to survive in an environment that was actively turning against the new research teams. They stopped seeing themselves as researchers or survivors. They became guardians. Their goal shifted from studying Zeta 9 to protecting it. They began subtly steering their colleagues away from sensitive areas, redirecting drilling projects that might disrupt the crystalline mountains, and downplaying discoveries that might attract corporate exploitation. They were not there to extract value. They were there to ensure the planet, in all its dangerous transformed glory, was allowed to exist. Their partnership model did not go unnoticed. The apparent success of their joint command, the ease of their cross-species communication, began to influence other projects. Command structures on other joint missions were reevaluated. The old rigid separation of human and Zeton teams started to give way to more integrated units. They had become a living case study, though no one knew the real reason for their effectiveness. They represented a new paradigm. Their cooperation was not built on treaties or diplomacy. It was built on a shared transformation, a fundamental change that had erased the lines between them. They were the blueprint for a future that neither of their species had imagined possible, a future where understanding did not require agreement, but a willingness to be changed by the other. They were the guardians of a secret and the bearers of a quiet, revolutionary hope. The story of Team Zeta was just beginning. Their bond proved that a simple act of compassion could bridge the deepest species divides. Tom and Elra's journey showed that understanding sometimes requires more than words. It demands mutual transformation. They became something new together, a fusion of human and alien guardian and guide. Their connection rewrote the rules of survival and cooperation. Sometimes salvation isn't about holding on to who you were. It's about having the courage to become what the moment needs, even if it means leaving your old self behind.